All right, we're inside Jack Palmer's house. Jack, how are you doing?
I'm doing well, thanks.
You took me on a tour of the house, which we're going to do on our show. We're going to see all the different artifacts from different centuries. I'm really excited for that. But let's first start with, who is Jack Palmer? How did you get into collecting these things?
Well, I'm from the Washington, D.C. area, and when I was a kid, my mom and dad spent a lot of time away. My father was injured in World War II and also had a genetic health issue. So they actually lived much of my youth in Boston. And my grandmothers, particularly the mom on my dad's side, raised me. And they're both history buffs. The Palmer side, that's my dad's side, was her family is from Virginia and Georgia, and my mom's side, her family is from northern Pennsylvania, and all the family goes back to the mid 1700s back to the early 1600s.
Wow. So you go from kind of being raised with a few history buffs to now being a history buff for yourself. I feel like we should just do a little background in your professional life. You've been a history professor, is that right?
No, I was actually the sciences, but the history's my primary hobby. I've worked in Stoughton in the public schools, and then have worked at various universities, and now have a international education program with a partner that is all throughout Asia and kind of just all over that part of the world. And I'm active in scouting, actually, doing some international scouting work too.
How did you land in the Eagle River area?
When I was a kid, Wide World of Sports. For those of you in TV land that are my age, you'll remember Wide World of Sports. And I'd watch the bobsled, and I'd watch the skiing and all that stuff. And I thought, I want to live where there's snow and pine trees. And I've been working my way here all my life.
You picked a good spot.
Yeah.
All right, so enough of Jack, though he's great. We're going to learn about your incredible collection here, starting with this item next. Can you give a little tease for our viewers, Jack?
Well, it's a cannonball. And it was found in an excavation of King Street in Trenton, New Jersey.
Okay, that's all you're going to get. We'll be right back after this commercial break. We're back on Up North at 4. We are in the museum/house, that is the Jack Palmer residence in the Eagle River area. So last time we talked about this cannonball. You gave us a little tip. It was used in the Battle of Trenton. So fill in the details for us. What's behind this cannonball?
Well, the story goes back to early 1776. And so Washington has an army. It's called the Continental Army. And we hope to be a new nation. And on July 4th, 1776, our Declaration of Independence was signed and announced. And we think we're a new country. Britain doesn't think so. So the early battles, most of them in New England, didn't go well for the American troops under Washington. They fought basically hopefully to a draw or something like that and retreating action, but the American army had an advantage. They lived here. The British army and those they hired to fight for Britain that came here, which is part of this story, were far away from home. And transportation from one continent to another took a long time. So they retreat and retreat and retreat and end up at a very well-known place called Valley Forge. And that's where the story of this really starts. Because on Christmas Day of 1776, so it's the beginning of the war, which lasted, by the way, over 7 years, we have several issues. First of all, the living conditions are horrible. It was a horrific winter. Many people have seen the paintings and the pictures of just shoeless soldiers just struggling to survive. Food was in short supply. Munitions were in short supply. And enlistments for many of the soldiers were running out. There were 1 year on January 1st. And so Washington is pretty desperate for a victory. And that's where the crossing of the Delaware comes in.
The famous painting.
Right, the famous painting and the stories of the flag and standing up in the boat, which is very unlikely because the conditions, there was ice in the river, it was sleeting, it was snowing, it was a mess. And so I'm sure they were sitting down as they crossed the river. But under cover of darkness, they cross the river. He takes 2,000 men with him. They get to the other side with their goal being Trenton, New Jersey. About 8 miles, then hiking through a snowstorm and rainstorm in the middle of the night to get set up and ready to engage Hessian troops, which we'll mention in a moment, at 8 o'clock in the morning, because it's the 26th of December now. And guess what they were doing on the 25th?
Celebrating,
enjoying life.
Drinking, perhaps.
Perhaps, but not expecting a surprise attack first thing in the morning on the 26th. But he still had his army at that point, and it was again in desperate need of a victory. So they surrounded them, and when the Hessians were still in bed, the battle began.
The cannonball has to be a part of that battle, Jack.
So there was a young captain who, people had noticed this guy. He was an immigrant. He lived somewhere in the Caribbean. And there's documentation of this man from the time he was 14 on. He had basically dreams of grandeur. And he actually wanted to participate in some major historic event like a war. Well, the American Revolution starts, so he emigrates to the United States. He went to a college initially, but quickly then joined the Army. And now he's 21, and he's not particularly educated, but super bright. And he's kind of a frail guy, too. He's not very big. He was, matter of fact, the night before they crossed the Delaware, he was in a house recovering from an illness. So this young man gets out because he's not going to miss the show. And he has a battery of 2 cannons. They're the only 6-pounders in Washington's army that at least crossed the Delaware. And that's important because provenance is a big thing. When you go to a museum and people say, this was George Washington's or this was Abraham Lincoln's, it's like the prove it thing. That can be hard to do. In this case, we know there were 2 6-pound cannons. We know where they were set up. There's actually a famous painting of it, very well documented. And they made it to Trenton. They set up the cannons, and they aimed them right down King Street, which is Main Street in Trenton, when the battle started.
So you still haven't told me who this mystery individual is.
I can't remember. Oh yeah, the guy from the musical.
Alexander Hamilton?
Alexander Hamilton.
Wow.
And so he was the commander of these 2 cannon. And one of the interesting stories of him and his cannons, he treated his cannons, one person said, like a horse. He would pet them. He would walk with them. He learned everything through books. He wasn't a trained artilleryman, and yet he became excellent. He was probably the best at his craft at that point in time in the entire army, just from studying and working hard. But he and the cannons became one, more or less. And of course, he had a crew, and he fired what's called grape shot and solid implements down this King Street, and then in the excavation, utility excavation in King Street, at least 2 6-pounders were found underneath the road. And thus here's one of them.
So Alexander Hamilton is the captain of the artillery. He's the one firing the cannons at this battle. This cannon ball was found, 6-pounder. It had to be him.
It had to be. And again, the significance for we Americans of that moment was that, remember, Washington's about to lose much of his army. he needs a victory desperately. The result of Valley Forge, and therefore Trenton, and the reason it's so famous, is that many of the troops now re-enlisted. Morale went up. It was a saving grace for the fledgling United States.
The first win.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Jack, we're just getting started on our tour. Thank you. That is, what an amazing item to have here in Eagle River. That's so cool.
Thanks.
We'll be right back on Up North at 4. We're going to head to another part of the Palmer residence. All right, we are back on our tour of the Jack Palmer residence. Jack, the cannonball story was great. This one is probably my close second to the thing that I just went wow to. So tell us about this document you got here.
Well, it's from London, and I wish the people in TV land could see the beautiful calligraphy in this, but it's an indentured servant document. A family many years ago sold 10 years of their lives away to earn money to come to the New World, to be indentured and work for a family here. And in the detail of the document, the story of the family is not exactly told, but we know who they are and when they came and that sort of thing. But the really cool thing about it is the family kept it for generations, and now it's here. But that's the razor of the father of the family that came to the New World from England. And they kept the razor with the document throughout all these many decades.
Does it have a year on it, this document?
I read exactly what it is, but it's not one of the really old ones. I actually have 3 of these. This isn't my oldest one, it's just the coolest looking one, and I think this goes back to like the late 1700s.
Why do you think people would feel compelled to uproot their lives, their ancestral home, and come to America to be a servant for 10 years?
That is the more than $1 million question, and I think it's important for us today to really think about that. Think of what these people went through. Think of our founding fathers and what they were risking, everything. These were mostly fairly wealthy people to fight a revolution to gain independence. Well, the people that came here from all over Europe and really the world, we are a worldwide nation of immigrants from everywhere. And in this case, the conditions at home had to be pretty rough. You're leaving your family, you're leaving most of your belongings. I have an immigrant chest in another room, and it contained everything a family brought. It's just hard to imagine what they were leaving behind. And you know you're never going to go back to your homeland. The chances are slim to see your family, see your friends. So the conditions that caused those people to come here are really amazing and special. And we should remember that, because these people, I mean, to say they gave up everything, even they may have been from their ancestral home for 1,000 years, and they come to a new world for a new beginning, because we're the land of promise, and we still are.
Okay, Jack, that's a good way to end it. We've done pre-revolutionary, we've done revolutionary with the cannonball. We're going to head upstairs and we're going to do Civil War era. We'll be right back on Up North at 4. We're back on Up North at 4, continuing our tour of the Jack Palmer residence near Eagle River. Jack, we've done revolutionary, pre-revolutionary. Let's talk Civil War now. You have a lot of cool artifacts up here. Looking at the ones behind us, let's start at the top. This looks like a Confederate $20 bill. Tell me about the story of that.
This is from my one great grandfather, who he was a physician. He was in Lee's army. And after the war, he went back to Georgia to doctor, and people lost everything. I also have his journal. After the war, he got paid in, the story being paid in chickens and corn, and he was, because it's in the journal. But before that, he owned a plantation. And when they sold it at the end of the war, when the war was lost, he would only accept Confederate money for the house, and it was worthless. So he was giving the plantation away, basically.
It's crazy that that was your great-grandfather. You're just 3 generations removed from
Right.
slave owning. People don't realize how close in history that was. How do you reconcile with the past, with your ancestor owning slaves?
Well, one of my philosophies, and I'm historically an educator myself, is you live in the present. We live now. So let's live life to the fullest. But let's plan for the future to make things better. In a previous conversation, we were talking about Alexis de Tocqueville from France, a philosopher who visited the U.S. extensively after the Revolution. And to paraphrase his comment on this fledgling nation, is the thing that makes America great is our ability to fix our mistakes. And that brings us to the past. So we have to learn from the past. We may not like it. It's not something I'm proud of, or a matter of fact, it bothers me. But at the same time, we move forward, and we got to learn from the past so we don't let those mistakes repeat themselves.
Switching gears to your piece at the bottom here. I think it's an interesting figure in history, but also you should tell how you found it, which is just a wild story as well.
Well, I was in Minocqua, and when I go through antique stores and places like that, most people, of course, are probably just looking at the furniture and on the walls. I like to look in the corners and on the floor and see what's there. And there was a stack of pictures and old frames, and I'm thumbing through them. And I'm probably halfway through the stack of, let's say, 14 framed objects when I saw this one. And I knew who it was, Charles Sumner, when I saw the picture.
And he's, of course, famous for being beaten on the Congress floor for being adamant against slavery.
And he was the first of the real firebrands that took it to the congressional floor. And from the time of George Washington on, George Washington wrestled with the whole concept of slavery. He was a slave owner himself, but he freed his slaves, as we discussed when he died. But even at the time of the Continental Congress, he was suggesting that maybe we should have freed the slaves then. But it didn't happen. And yet I think the founding fathers knew eventually it was coming, and unfortunately it took a civil war to do it. But this man was one of the key people in leading us to that conflict. And he also was very influential in Abraham Lincoln's life, because he was a mentor to Abraham Lincoln regarding Lincoln's positions on slavery.
Finally, let's take a look at this letter. This is from an ancestor of yours. Tell me about that.
Yeah, this was written by my great-great-great-grandfather. Now we're back to the Confederate side. He was in the 1st Virginia Cavalry, Company E. And he's a person who lived through the whole war. He was injured once, but did not pass away. And this was written, and it's called Free 1865. So it was written at the end of the war. And he had lost many of his best friends, but features one in particular. And he's lamenting through this poem the lost 4 years, the hardships and how difficult it was. And the free refers to his deceased friend. He's free. He died in battle. And now my ancestor is looking to an uncertain future. And in this case, he's going back to Virginia. And the future at that point was pretty bleak for a lot of people in the South. The South had been largely destroyed, and their economy was all but gone.
And it can be easy to romanticize the Civil War, but wasn't that great?
No.
It was terrible.
No. War is terrible, a horrible thing. When we look back, the wars are the tough times. At the end of a war, the only celebrating you see is because it's over. You don't see, people are celebrating the end of the war because it's a very difficult experience. It impacted my father greatly in terms of his health in World War II.
Thank you so much, Jack. We're going to continue our tour next time. We're going to head to the Western Room here at the Jack Palmer residence. We'll be right back. We're back on Up North at 4. It's our final stop on the tour of the Jack Palmer residence in Eagle River, Wisconsin. So, Jack, we're now in the basement, kind of a Western theme down here. Let's focus on the piece immediately behind us. What are these chaps, I guess I would call them?
And it's so cool. They caught your eye when we first came down here, and I'm glad they did, because this represents our Spanish heritage. I didn't know what picking was. There's a well-known television show where people pick stuff. Well, I didn't know this, but I'm a historical picker. And I like to go to places that are kind of junky looking, look for treasures. And I was driving through central Arizona, and I passed one of these places. I was outside. It's a very dry climate there. And there's an old wooden fence around a space. And I could see in there was just stuff everywhere. And I stopped and talked to the person there, and he took me in. And I looked in one of his little outbuildings and saw this in there and said, "Oh, that's cool. I want it." And he then told me the story of this being potentially 17th century, 1600s Spanish, Mexican.
So chaps, this is something that a person would wear while riding horseback?
Right, and in central Arizona and south, many of the places in Mexico, sure, there's desert, but there's a lot of like chaparral, thorny, thickety locations, and if you take your horse through there, even horses sometimes need to be protected. But this would be something that would go around your pants, it'd buckle up here, and these cover your legs, so when you're driving or riding, through thorny brush, you don't injure yourself.
Okay, Jack, thank you so much for bringing me on this tour of your lovely home here. We've done pre-revolutionary, revolutionary, Civil War, and, Mexican-American history in the American Southwest. So, man, this has been fun. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.